and then we
I'll go
won't
ahead
hear
and-
you.
I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. It doesn't mean you can't
Good.
unmute yourselves, which feel free to do when we have an opportunity for asking questions. But pay attention at the bottom, there is a chat, so that if you want to put down a thought or a question, or if you at the end want to use the raise your hand function, you can do that too, so you don't feel like you're being so isolated here that you can't communicate. I hope that helps. Let's see if I've
So
muted everyone.
what's the weather like in Dayton?
Everybody's muted. They can't answer you.
You can tell me.
I can tell you, I think it was supposed to be in the 60s today. At least that's what my child said when he wanted to wear shorts. So I'm
was-
hoping that's true.
65 today.
Excellent.
Okay.
I know I spent a lot of time playing basketball outside this weekend. And again, it was 40 some of the time too, so who knows?
In Washington, D.C., it's 75.
Oh, goodness.
I will.
Wonder
mute
for
you.
once I
just
wanna be
wanted to
there.
let you know. I am in shorts.
It's because you're thinking about hiking in Israel, right? Shorts and all that good stuff.
We're expected to have 84 tomorrow, but it's an aberration because today was like 70. Tomorrow is going to be 84, and then it's going to get really cold and start raining again on Thursday. Okay, we're ready to go. It's
It is right on the money. If you would like to begin, I was just trying to find your bio online because I didn't do much of an introduction and I can't seem to find it. So I don't know if you wanted to spend just a moment just to share a little about yourself, but you don't have to.
well, as you already heard, certainly anyone who was here yesterday, I grew up in South Africa. I made Aliyah, moved to Israel, 1st of February 1987. I've been here the majority of my life. I live in the city of Modi'in. It's the Hanukkah city, which is midway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And I work and have worked since I was a CIT. I mean, since I was a counselor in training, I've worked in Jewish education, formally, guiding, teaching, for a number of years in classroom settings, and then over the last 25 years, more guiding than classroom, and the increasingly also Jewish sites out of Israel. So initially it was just Poland, but gradually it's including all of Europe. And just today I was invited on the 25th of April to go and spend 4 days in the United Arab Emirates, because there is a lot of interest in groups, especially second timers, that have been to Israel to combine on their next trip. Once upon a time, it was Israel, Egypt, or Israel, Jordan. People have checked those boxes, and so now there's an interest for guiding and teaching the United Arab Emirates, and I will be going in the second half of April to learn about that. This is what I do. I guide, I tour, and instead of talking about me, let's talk about Galilee. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, we just give me a thumbs up. Are we seeing that? Good. Okay, excellent. So yesterday we were touring in the desert, and today we're touring in Galilee. My backdrop is green and flowers, and the image that you can see is green, flowers, and even a bit of a lake which is called the Sea of Galilee in English. The Galilee doesn't always look like this. This is the winter and the springtime look of Galilee. But even in the summertime, there are still lots of trees. There is still green. There is still water. As the summer wears on, a lot of the grass will turn to a yellow color. So this is the great time to tour Galilee, because this is the time when the Galilee is very, very green. So where is the Galilee? The Galilee is a relatively small part of Israel. If we were to draw a line from Haifa across to what's called here Lake Kinneret, which is another name for the Sea of Galilee, if we would draw a line across this way, only that area to the north would be Galilee. So we're talking about 20, maybe 25% of the physical area of the land of Israel. It is a very mountainous area. It is an area that has rivers, or at least we call them rivers. You'd probably call them creeks or streams. Nevertheless, has flowing water. This is not a country with major rivers. And the Galilee is an area that has a series of mountains. As one goes north, the mountains actually get higher. And Lebanon, which is the next country to the north, has even higher mountains covered in snow. And it's the snow from those mountains that are source of much of the water in Galilee. Galilee is actually Talmudic Hebrew, not modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew, when we say Galil, we mean Galilee. But in Talmudic Hebrew, when you said Galil, you meant province. And this was indeed a distant province, far away from Jerusalem. Where does Galilee begin? We're standing now on Mount Carmel. Carmel, same mountain that the city of Haifa is built on. And Carmel means God's, El is God, Elohim. You may be familiar with the word from the liturgy. Carmel means God's grove or God's vineyard. So when we stand on Mount Carmel, we look out over a valley. This is the valley of Jezreel, which is a very important farming area in Israel today. And we're looking out to Galilee. In the distance, we can see a number of other mountains. If we were to turn around and look the other way, we would not be looking at Galilee. We would be looking at range of Carmel Mountains and then down into an area which we call the Sharon. Now, Galilee was very, very important in the history of the Jewish people as the place of a great revolution. And I'm not talking about a revolution in picking up and fighting against the Romans. I'm talking about when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they didn't destroy Galilee. The Jews of Jerusalem came to Galilee, and little villages all over Galilee, they had to work out how to carry on living without a temple. And we have all over Galilee synagogues decorated with mosaic floors, Jewish elements very clear in the mosaic floor. For example, the two menorahs, the candlesticks on either side of the Ark of the Law, and two primitively made, but two lions, symbols of Judah. This wasn't a revolution. This was just the art. Revolution was to come with a basis of Judaism that would survive without the temple. It was rabbinic Judaism. The writers of the Mishnah and the writers of the Talmud are based in Galilee. Here we have a mosaic floor from another synagogue. This is a very interesting mosaic floor because it actually has the zodiac around the floor of the synagogue. And in the middle of the zodiac, they actually have Helios, the Roman god, or the Greek god of the sun, in the middle of the mosaic. And so we see that these people were not scared of dusting and living alongside the Romans and the Greeks, and at the same time preserving their Jewish culture. you know, when one thinks of zodiac, one doesn't normally associate zodiac with a Jewish symbol. We have not one, but many synagogues in Galilee with zodiacs as part of their decoration. These people in Ipori, in Tiberias, in Beit Alpha, these were the same people that were writing the Mishnah, writing the Talmud. The Galilee was a revolution. It was the Talmud became the core of Jewish life, and in many ways sets the core of Jewish life until today, because we may think of ourselves as modern Jews, perhaps less connected to that style of Judaism, but we celebrate Passover when we do. That's determined by decisions made in the Talmud. And we celebrate Rosh Hashanah when we do, and so on. These were the kinds of things that were going on in these little villages in Galilee. And so Galilee is a good place for the revolution because it was kind of off the beaten track. The Romans weren't that worried about it. We're now going to drive up the coast from Haifa, from Mount Carmel, and come into the Crusader city of Akko. Giving the Hebrew spelling here, Akko. English spelling is often A-C-R-E, Acre. But, we call it Akko. Akko is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. By the way, a city mentioned in the Talmud for great rabbis who lived there long, long ago. It rises to really significant prominence during the Crusader period. The Crusaders conquered Jerusalem and then they're kicked out of Jerusalem, but they hold on to the coastline. And they have a series of cities all the way along the coastline, which they use to control import-export from the land of Israel to Europe. And here we can see what's called the Templar Tunnel. Templars were one of the orders of the Knights, of the Crusader Knights, and this was their tunnel that connected their compound where they lived and where their stores were to the port. Interestingly, this was discovered in the early 80s when a woman had a plumbing problem. She had a plumbing problem. She called the plumbers in. The plumbers started digging, and they said, "This is way bigger than this is not." They discovered it, and they had the good sense to call in the archaeologists. And this tunnel, turns out, was that by the end of the Crusader period, various different Crusader groups were not allied. They were actually competing in the market, and they wanted to be able to safely take their goods to the port, from the port, without having to go through the competing groups of knights, and hence they build the tunnel. By the way, you can walk through this tunnel. I need to stoop in 2 or 3 places, but most of the time I can stand up straight, just to give you a sense of how the tunnel really is. Of course, Akko is also an important Muslim city until today. Remember, 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs, and 85 to 90% of those Arabs are Muslims. I'm not talking about the Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza. I'm talking about citizens of the state of Israel. And Akko is one of the most important cities, I think, with the exception of the mosque in Jerusalem. This is the second or third most important mosque that we have. And unlike the Golden Dome in Jerusalem, which non-Muslims cannot visit, we are able, respectfully, not as people coming to pray, anyone can come and pray, but as non-believers, we are able to visit the mosque as long as we dress appropriately. And I'm trying to see if we dress appropriately. There we go. Okay, so here we have some people dressed appropriately with their heads covered. Women are obliged to cover their heads. If one comes in the summertime, sleeves and dresses to below the knee, or garments to below the knees, are required as well. And of course, to take off our shoes. One of the other things about Galilee is the opportunity to eat ethnic Galilee food, Druze food, or the Arab food. This was a Druze feast that we were about to have. I learned to wash my hands long before Corona, long before the COVID crisis, because you can see there's not much silverware there. The way one typically eats this meal is to take the bread and to use the bread to dip it in and to pick up the bits of food. They've got used to the tourists coming, and they give you a plate and a knife and fork as well. For not a knife, just a fork. It's all, you don't need to cut anything. For those who need it, it's a chance to taste the food. And the reason I'm spending just a few minutes on this particular topic is that although 20% of Israelis are Arab minority, in Galilee, that figure is more than 50%. So it's a majority minority area. And relations are very good. I would be foolish if I said there weren't tensions. I would be lying if I said to you there weren't tensions that developed around certain issues and at certain times. By and large, there is a lot of cooperation, and it's quite typical to have the experience that we're having here of tasting some traditional food, strong flavors, lots of bread, lots of hummus. This particular place is actually kosher. Why would an Arab serve kosher food? Because the same reason that my late father-in-law had a Christmas tree in his store. Were his clients. Clients wanted to be, to commemorate their holidays. And this guy understands that most of the people coming to taste his food for an experience are Jewish, and as a result creates possibility of kosher meal. So they don't have served at this meal something called labana, which is a goat's cheese, which is another Galilee classic. But we got the meat meal, so I have to come back to try the dairy next time. We continue along the shore all the way to the very, very northern edge of Israel on the border with Lebanon. And as you can see on the map, we were at a place called Rosh HaNikra. Rosh HaNikra are grottos that used to only be accessible by sea. One had to swim out or kayak out and come in. I'm talking about until the 1940s. During the 1940s, the British Army built a railway line from Beirut to Haifa. And as part of the access to that railway line, they cut a tunnel through the rock along the edge. And as a result, we can now, if we go down in the cable car, we can now walk through the caves, through the grottos, and see quite spectacular sights of caves formed by the sea. It's just the spectacle. There's no historical events of great significance that happened here, but it remains the border point. Because when one visits Rosh HaNikra, we go in a cable car down to the caves, and as we go down, we can look out to sea and see a row of buoys which mark the border at sea between Israel and Lebanon. And above the cable car, we can see the radar turning around right there on our border with Lebanon. Galilee is filled with forests. And I'm going to bet many of you have contributed to those forests. Your grandparents contributed to those forests and gave you the certificates when you were kids. Jewish National Fund forests planted all over the country, but the obvious place to plant them is Galilee, because Galilee has the climate that allows the forests to thrive. They have recovered as more and more places are planted with NF forests. Some of the indigenous forests have also recovered. And today the Galilee forests are actually a place of recreation. And there are, in addition, when you pay the dollar, whatever one pays these days, $18 or whatever it is to plant a tree, they don't only use the money to plant trees, but they use the money to create trails into the forest. They use the money to put picnic tables. They use the money to put children's playgrounds. And many Israelis, one of the upsides of the corona crisis has been that many Israelis have rediscovered their own country. Because people used to travel here, and then lately, the last couple of years, or they've been going overseas, and we've been unable to travel or failed in our travel over the last year, and many people have rediscovered the great forests of Galilee as a place to go and recreate. Let's move on now to the other great revolution, or the second of the three great revolutions in Galilee, and this is in the city of Tzfat. Jewish people have four holy cities: Hebron, where the patriarchs and most of the matriarchs are buried; Jerusalem, holy city that we will spend much more time talking about when we get there in 2 days' time; and Tiberias, which we will get to in a moment, where the final process of that Talmudic writing occurs. Mishnah is redacted, as we say. And the last, chronologically, not in terms of significance, of these cities is Tzfat, in which Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, is its golden age. Now, Jewish mysticism, according to the Jewish tradition, has been around since the 2nd century, when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai writes a book called the Zohar. It was an undercurrent until the dramatic events of 1492. Now, I know that Americans have one set of dramatic events from 1492, when Columbus sails the ocean blue. Something else happens in 1492. That was the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And they were expelled by the same Ferdinand and Isabella. They were expelled by the Catholics, having had a golden age under the Muslims. And so the inclination of most of the Jews now expelled by the Spanish Christians were to go to Muslim countries. And a significant number of them went to Turkey. Turkey was expanding. In 1516, Turkey takes the Galilee. In 1516, a group of Jews come and settle in Tzfat. They settle in Tzfat and don't settle in Jerusalem because, in their logic, Jewish life in Galilee had ended. The Talmudic period was the last period of Jewish life in the Holy Land before we went completely to exile. And to pick up the story, they needed to come back to Galilee. They come back to Galilee and they look for the hidden clues in Jewish mysticism, in Kabbalah, which becomes no longer a marginal phenomenon, but mainstream. And inside the Tzfat are many little synagogues, Ashkenazi synagogues, Sephardi synagogues, synagogues much, much smaller than your temple, synagogues, some of them where you can have 20, 25 people in the minyan, and a small and separate women's section. In this particular synagogue, the women's section is up there behind the curtain. And in these little synagogues, we know the name, the great rabbi that used to pray there, the great Talmudic, Kabbalistic scholar that used to pray there. We're looking at the synagogue of someone called Ari. And rabbis always, the great medieval rabbis always had an acronym. RI is an acronym, Adonenu Rabbi Yitzchak, our Lord and teacher Isaac. His name was Isaac Luria. He's only in Tzfat for 3 years. He arrives age 35, he dies age 38. In those 3 years, he revolutionizes Judaism. He takes Kabbalah from being something marginal, something in the hands of a small group of elite. He popularizes it. He takes a mystical service, welcome the Sabbath, which is called Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat begins here in Tzfat, not in the synagogue, but probably outside the synagogue, because they went to welcome the synagogue, they went to welcome the Shabbat outside, and then came into the synagogue for the Ma'ariv service, for the evening service. In Tzfat, they believe in miracles. And what you can see is the side of the bima, where there's a hole in the side of the bima. It's probably about waist height on me. And the story goes that in 1948, in the War of Independence, the traditional Jews were not out fighting. They're gathered in the synagogue to pray. And while they're praying, a mortar shell lands outside, explodes, and a piece of shrapnel comes flying into the synagogue, exactly at the Aleinu. And the gentleman standing next to the bima bows his head down, as one traditionally does during the Aleinu prayer. The piece of shrapnel misses him, and of course, this is a miracle. And the miracle is commemorated by, they never ever repair the hole, and instead they mark it for us and they show it to us, because that's how things work in Tzfat. In Tzfat, miracles didn't happen once upon a time. The people who live in Tzfat, miracles still happen today. There's something else that we always like to do in Tzfat. That, of course, is to shop. Tzfat is known for its Jewish art. Today, there are many, many artists who've settled in Tzfat who paint all kinds of things, but you can find anything from jewelry, candles, the special Shabbat or Havdalah or Hanukkah candles, especially pictures painted, whether it's your dancing Hasidim or pictures made of calligraphy. People who took the art of calligraphy, but instead of writing, make pictures using letters. And Tzfat is a regular shopping place. It's not the kind of place that many Israelis go shopping, and these people have had a particularly hard time in the corona crisis. The Ari is buried in Tzfat. He was living there in the middle of the 1500s. He died there and he was buried there. And this is not a site that I get to visit typically with a group like yours. It is a site that is visited by another population who come to pray at the grave of the Ari until today. And I did some due diligence. I went down to his grave and had a very different experience, as you can see, with the people gathered around his grave. Incredibly passionate people praying at the grave of the Ari. Third revolution. The third revolution in Galilee is the pioneering revolution, the beginning of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. And the first of the places that we have where there was settlement is a place called Rosh Pinah. You know the name Rosh. You know the Hebrew word Rosh because of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. Rosh Pinah, cornerstone. 16 families bought a small piece on the land, the edge of a malarial swamp, and gave it the Grand Roy's name, Rosh Pinah, cornerstone. And this was the beginning of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. Now, of course, there had been a Jewish presence in the holy cities, the 4 cities that I mentioned already, as well as in a number of small villages, but these were the first people to move out of Tzfat and to come combine with another group of people that came from Romania and together to build a new settlement. Now, in the beginning, things were very, very difficult for them. Very difficult for them because of the bad air. And if there are any Latin scholars here, bad in Latin, mal, aria, the malaria, we know, of course, today comes from the female Anopheles mosquito. We know today it comes from the swamps, which we no longer have. The swamps have been drained and we are not a malarial country anymore. But in the early days, malaria was a serious, serious problem in the area of Rosh Pinah. Nevertheless, a small settlement was established, and later on, when their sons and daughters grew older and there wasn't enough space in the original settlement, they bought another piece of land and expanded, and it was the beginnings of Jewish settlements in the 1880s. They don't even have a word for what they're doing yet. This is before Herzl. Not Zionist yet, just coming back, very traditional families, coming to fulfill the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel, but creating a revolution, which will be developed further by some other people that we'll see in a little while. Here we have 2 images of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret, Yam Kinneret. The Sea of Galilee is tiny. When you consider the whole of the state of Israel can fit into some of the Great Lakes in the United States. So it's a small lake, but it is very significant in Israel. 1/3 of our natural water supply. It's a freshwater lake. This is called the sea, but this is not salt water. This is fresh water. 1/3 of our natural freshwater supply flows through this lake. The Jordan River flows into the lake from the north, from the melted snow, and flows out of the lake and continues down to the Dead Sea. When I was growing up, this was 1/3 of our water, along with the mountain aquifer and the coastal aquifer. Today, it's only 1/4 of our water because we're getting about 1/4 of our water from desalination from the Mediterranean Sea. And in the future, we're actually going to get more and more of our water from desalination because we have pretty much using all of the freshwater supplies we can. There's nothing else that we can use. And so we will use more and more seawater that is desalinated. The Sea of Galilee, the city that you can see in the picture at the top, is the city of Tiberias. Tiberias, one of the 4 holy cities. Tiberias is a very important city for Christian tourists. Not so much for Tiberias, but for the events that happen around the lake in the ministry of Jesus. Tiberias provides the hotels and the restaurants and the infrastructure for those tourists to stay. And also for Israelis who go to the lake for the same reason that anyone else goes to lake, to swim and to kayak and to jet ski and so on. Here we can actually see on the shores of the Jordan River a group of Christian pilgrims coming to be baptized. And for many Jewish visitors, the visit to the Western Wall is a highlight moment. Many Christian visitors, the opportunity to go into the Sea of Galilee, or in this case, into the Jordan River, and to be baptized is a highly significant moment. And it's actually interesting. Jews and Christians were very different parts of the Galilee. Most Jewish groups don't go to Nazareth. We didn't go to Nazareth on our tour today. Most Jewish groups, if they go to the Jordan River, as we will do, they go to the Jordan River to kayak or to rub a tube. They don't go to the Jordan River to baptize. If they go to the Sea of Galilee, they go there to eat the fish
Oh, my Lord.
Very different experiences for different populations in how we relate to Galilee. And of course, for Christians, it is the beginning of Jesus' ministry that's important, and not these revolutions of the writing of the Mishnah, the beginning of Jewish mysticism, and the beginning of Zionist settlement in the land. And on the theme of Zionist settlement, here we are at the grave of someone called Rachel. This is the tomb of Rachel. Now, this is not Rachel, one of the matriarchs, one of the four matriarchs from the Bible. She's popular enough that we don't need a family name on the tomb. You can just write Rachel. We can see lots of stones placed on the tomb. She gets a lot of visitors. And you can actually see that alongside the tomb, there is a bench that has been put here. And this metal box can be opened. And inside the box is a copy of her poems. Rachel is the mother of modern Hebrew poetry. She was a young woman who moves to the land of Israel and comes to work with the pioneers in Galilee. When she comes to work with the pioneers in Galilee, she falls in love with the landscape. And after 2 years of studying agriculture, she has the opportunity to go and study in France. She's really torn because she loves the landscape. She loves living in the land of Israel. She understands that if she studies agriculture in France and she comes back with more skills, she will be able to give more to the growth of this country. So she goes to France. Shortly after she gets there, World War I begins. And she's trapped in Europe until 1917. And in 1917, on the very first boat back, she comes back to the land of Israel and comes back to Galilee. Unfortunately, while she was in Europe, she contracted tuberculosis, and she's not strong enough to work in the physically demanding work in the kibbutz at the edge of the shore of Galilee. And she's asked to leave because there was no space for weakness amongst these tough pioneers. And she writes many poems, many sad poems, poems of longing for the landscape, poems of longing an identity with Rachel, matriarch, who has fertility issues. She, in the end, never marries, never has her own children. You cannot go through a day of Israeli radio without hearing a song of Rachel's. You cannot go through a year in the Israeli school system without learning some of her poems set in your literature classes. And every Israeli performer, this is Achinoam Nini, one of our most famous performers, every Israeli performer today has also performed Rachel's music. So this is a picture of her as a young woman, and her one of her most famous songs, I wish I had a son, a little boy, white with black curly hair. I would take his hand in mine and stroll slowly through the garden. Little boy, Uri I'd call him, my Uri. How gentle and clear this tiny name. A glimmer of joy for my little boy. Uri I'd call him, Uri I'd call. But I'm still bitter as Rachel. I'm still praying as Hannah in Shiloh. I'm still waiting for him. I will wait. You could hear the biblical echoes in my reading of this poem in English. Let me tell you that in Hebrew, the resonance between the biblical metaphor and the modern longing of a young woman for a child is very, very powerful. And it's one of the interesting things of this third revolution, because the Zionist revolution was, on the one hand, a very secular revolution, on the other hand, deeply connected to the traditional texts of not only the Bible, but of the land of the Hebrew people, of the Talmud, and of the land of Israel in general. And to finish the image of the second Aliyah, the farm that Rachel lived on in the beginning is the image at the top. And she's not, as far as I know, in this particular picture. This is what that area looks like. A picture taken of the same area now. So back then, barren, learning to farm, and today filled with orchards of bananas and avocados and citrus, fish ponds for the raising of all kinds of fish, which are being harvested right now as people start buying their ingredients for their seders. This is a major success of the development of many of the things that become synonymous with Israel, the kibbutz, moshav, agricultural excellence, all begin in that little farm. This is not the one we saw before. This is a place called Ganya, which was the first kibbutz. And another look at Tiberias, this time from the lake, looking up at the city, and in the lower picture, looking at the lake as it looked 2 years ago when we had 6 bad years of rain. 6 years we'd had rain, but never enough rain for 6 years. Things in this country happen, biblically, like in the time of Joseph. The last 2 years have been very, very good years, and the lake is once again full. In that case, it would be full all the way up to this wall that you see over here. You can see a white line on this building. Back over here, that's the water line in a typical year, and the water is back to that. Here we have the River Jordan. Like I say, you'd probably call it a creek from where you come. Something like this in South Africa might not have even had a name. We would have just called it one of the tributaries leading into whatever serious river was in the area. It is very significant because the Jordan River is the main source of water flowing into the Sea of Galilee, and it is also a place where summertime tourists have the opportunity to, it's not whitewater rafting, the river is much too gentle, but have the opportunity to experience rubber tubing or rubber boating down the Jordan River. A little bit further north of the Sea of Galilee is an area which we call the Hula Swamp. It is only about 5 to 6% of the area of the swamp as it was 150 years ago. It's double the area that it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Because in the 1950s, the swamp is drained. And when the swamp is drained, they leave a small area as a nature reserve. What we discovered was that a lot of sediment was being washed down into the Sea of Galilee because the swamp had acted as a filter to, when there's heavy storms flowing down from the Golan Heights in the background and bringing all the dirt with it, it would flow all the way down to the sea. So they reflooded part of the swamp. And today it's about 7% of its original size. It's a fantastic, fantastic nature reserve. And we have the opportunity to see millions of birds. 500 million birds fly over the land of Israel twice a year. There are 2 highways, skyways, if you like, for birds that fly from Europe to Africa. One in west over Gibraltar, and one in the east over Israel. Bird watchers from all over the world come in the spring and the fall to watch these bird migrations. Once the swamp is reflooded, it turns out that many birds don't go further south. We have tens of thousands of cranes that winter here in the land of Israel, and many, many other birds that pass through and use the swamp as a refueling station to eat before they continue their long journey, some of them all the way down to South Africa all the way up to the northern parts of the Ukraine. The swamp was completely flat. So today, to tour the swamp reserve, we often do it in bicycles. You don't have to be very good at cycling as long as you keep the bicycle up, because it's completely flat. And many people tour the area with bicycles. We can also tour the area in golf carts, or if you want a really close-up experience, they take people out with a tractor-drawn trailer. And the birds are so used to the farmers working in the area that they don't flee the tractor trailer, and one can get really, really close. Really a special experience to get close to nature in our crowded little country. If you're really, really lucky, and I've been really lucky maybe 4 or 5 times in my entire life, and I go to these reserves very, very often, you get to see these animals. These are not plastic imitations of animals. These are actually the animals themselves. They are only, I don't know, about the big ones are 6 or 7 inches long, and the younger ones are smaller. These are salamanders. They look like they're made of plastic, bright orange or yellow color. They are a protected species. They are, with the reflooding of the swamp, seeing them a lot more because their population has expanded as the conditions that are good for them to live in have expanded as well. We are also able to see swamp cats. Swamp cat is probably the size, when it stands, of an Alsatian dog. Very different shape, very long, narrow legs, and a much narrower animal. But that's a predator that both catches fish and some of the other smaller mammals. And the animal that you see at the bottom is a nutria. It's actually a South American animal brought to Israel initially to be used to cope. Were brought in 1951. They thought they were going to make fur hats out of it. In our climate, it didn't produce the fur that it needed for the fur hats, and someone just released them, and they now have pretty much settled in the land of Israel. So we have some people, some animals that made Aliyah from South America, and they've also now at home in the reserve. I don't know if I would say they're endangering any indigenous species, but they certainly were not here until 1951. We looked at Galilee agriculture from up above, but as one gets a little bit closer, and in the northern parts of the Galilee, there are different crops, no longer bananas, but a lot of field crops, apples, and other deciduous fruits, and especially grapes. Most surprising thing for many people is that once upon a time, the agricultural product that we associated with Israel was citrus fruit. And you can see in the upper picture the trees, citrus trees. For decades, the biggest export from Israel is avocados, no longer citrus. Citrus, in fact, Carmel, and in fact, Jaffa oranges are now a trademark. Jaffa oranges are not necessarily grown in Israel anymore. And the profit margins on oranges are very low, whereas avocados get a much, much better price. And Israel is a major exporter of avocados to Europe. I'm just checking out time here. We're good. Okay. We saw the Jordan River before, but the Jordan River is actually fed by a whole lot of small little streams. And most people enjoy going to see a waterfall or going to see a stream. But when you realize that 2/3 of our country is the landscape we saw yesterday, 2/3 of our country is desert. So the passion that people have for this kind of landscape, the passion that people have for water, this is a waterfall called the Banyas. Banyas, because there was a temple next to the stream for the Roman god Pan, the Greek god Pan. And the Arabs don't have a P sound. So when they wanted to say Banyas, they said Banyas. And that's the origin of the name of this river, which is a waterfall, which is one of the tributaries of the Jordan. I told you the landscape looked very different in the summertime. Still green, much yellower, much drier. We're not seeing the wild flowers. We're now on the Golan Heights, doing an off-the-road jeep trip up onto the Golan Heights, because there are roads that buses can travel on the Golan Heights, but if one wants to visit sites of the 67 war or the 73 war, it's better to go off-road. It's a lot of fun. In the winter, it's a lot of mud, and in the summer, as you can see, it's a lot of dust. From the top, we can look down. These are the fish ponds, some of the fish ponds that I mentioned. This is the orchards of the kibbutz, and you can clearly see where Israel ends. The people on this side have the same amount of water as the people on this side. Soil quality on that side and the soil quality on this side are the same. Israel has far more intensely developed from an agricultural point of view and from an infrastructure point of view, our side of the river, of the border, than the Lebanese have. This is Lebanon, and we're looking into southern Lebanon from Golan Heights looking northwards. Here we are at another military position. This is a military position that is maintained and could become useful if there ever were a threat from Syria. And we're looking into Syria. This white line, I don't know how many people can see it over here. Everything that way from that line is Syria. And everything, all those towns that we see in the distance are Syria as well. This is a place called Mount Bental. During the early stages of the Syrian civil war, one could stand here and see plumes of smoke and hear the occasional shooting sounds of the Syrian civil war. So Galilee is surrounded by Lebanon to the north and Syria to the south. And over here, you can make out Mount Hermon covered in snow. We'll get a better view of it in just a while. There we go. So Mount Hermon is the only place in Israel where one can ski or sled. This is a picture of my family many, many years ago. The little boy in the red cap has already had his bar mitzvah. I grew up in Africa, so I don't know how to ski. But, I went to have the experience of snow, as many, many Israelis do. In a bad year, the season can only be a few weeks. A good year, the season can be a few months. It's not a long season. And of that whole snow-capped mountain that you see, which is Mount Hermon, only 7% of it is in Israel. Some of it is in Lebanon, and the majority of it is in Syria. We do have access to snow and to the mountains, but we only have part of the mountain. And that snow is part of the same reason that the Banyas stream flows, and that water that flows down through the Sea of Galilee, through the Jordan River to the Sea of Galilee, actually all the way down to the Dead Sea, comes from these mountains. And just before we end, and I take any questions, Baron Rothschild, who helped the settlers in Rosh Pinah, was involved in the wine industry. He was a vintner. He also saw in the planting of grapes and the establishment of a wine industry market. He said, let's make wine for Kiddush. Jews around the world are going to want to buy wine from the Holy Land. And he establishes already in the 1880s Carmel Winery, which the beginning, not just the beginning, for about the first 50 years, makes an Israeli version of Manischewitz. It's a ritual wine. It's sticky, thick, sweet wine. Since then, we have been through an absolute revolution in winemaking. And one of the favorite experiences I have with the group that either includes a winery in his trip, or even I've had groups that came on a food and wine tour and went to 4 or 5 different wineries over their time in Israel. And there are world-class wines today. Israel is a medal-winning in making wines, from small boutique wineries to the big wineries making millions and millions of bottles of wine. Galilee, which has mountains, Golan, which has mountains, hot summers, cold winters, is ideal terroir for making of wine. And as you can see, some people that came with me before had the opportunity to taste some wines in one of my favorite wineries. So I'm going to stop the share so I can see your faces, and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments that you have in the few minutes that we still have.
Mookie, I have Diane here. I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, you mentioned waste products of salination in the Sea of Galilee. What is the waste products and what do they do with them? Of salination.
The desalination is in the Mediterranean.
Oh, okay.
Because the Sea of Galilee, we can't use more water without depleting the lake.
Okay.
We can't use more water we can't pump more water from the mountain aquifers. We've used up all of our natural water supply. The only option is to desalinate.
Okay.
Waste product of desalination is the salt. In other words, you take out, for, don't quote me on the figures, but for every 100% of water, 80% of the water is good water, and you put all of the salinity into the other 20% and drop it back in the sea. It is literally a drop in the ocean. I mean, even though Israel is generating 25% of our water, that is not the issue. If one wanted to find what the environmental challenge of desalination is, it's the energy that we need to use,
right,
in order to extract the salinity from the water, because they use a process called reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is pushing the water through a membrane at high pressure. In order to create the pressure to push the water through the membrane, you need a lot of energy. So I'm not saying that there are no waste products from the water, but that is the way, that's the energy waste products are the problem, not from the actual water itself.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Right, so there's a question here from Jim Jacobson, Beit She'an. We had an hour to tour Galilee. Let me tell you, and rabbis heard me say this, that if you were here for 10 days, I would still say you only came for 10 days. There are more things to do and see. We can't do it all. And in fact, some temples do a second timers trip. They do a couple of trips for first timers, and then they do a second timers trip where we do the things that people didn't manage to do the first time. Shan is a great example of a Roman era city. It was actually one of the Decapolis, the 10 Roman cities. Southernmost of those cities, all the others are into Turkey, or from Syria and into Turkey of today. There was a league of Roman era cities. And we have a temple, and we have a theater, and we have massive colonnaded streets. Definitely somewhere else worth visiting, but not somewhere we visited today. It sits on the same line that the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea sit on, which is the Syrian African Rift Valley, and it was destroyed by an earthquake. And so, unlike cities that are destroyed by conquest, when a conqueror comes in, they knock walls down in all sorts of different directions. When an earthquake jolts a city, it all falls the same way. And so in terms of reconstruction, in terms of finding the remains, it's a much simpler process. You know, you just pull them back up, as opposed to challenges that we face in excavating a city that was destroyed by a conqueror. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, can I ask a question to pick up
Sure.
on what you said, Mookie? Good to see you.
You.
What's the latest thinking, uncertain as it is, about when the next temple trip might be, if the rabbi's still on?
That's a question for the rabbi.
I know if
Um,
she's still on.
I was going to say, I mean, we'd hope to be able to do it this year. And obviously, this was not the right year for us to be touring, but we certainly are hoping that as things open up and it's safe, that we go back as soon as we can. That's my hope. And Teresa's going to help me put together an itinerary, she's already said. So we will not delay.
I mentioned to Rabbi yesterday, I think it was before the session started, just in conversation, I have received 4 bookings in the last week from between December of 21 and May of 22. So I think no one is talking of coming in the next few months, and I think we're all waiting to see. And of course, none of those bookings are carved into stone just yet, but I think we do have a sense things are starting to revert back to usual. We were promised that we were going to be able to have normal seders, and the Minister of Health said that if the trend continues as it is at the moment, we will be able to have normal seders. In other words, we'll be able to have guests, we'll be able to, so on, and that we can't have guests from out the country yet. I have a friend who had a baby, his parents couldn't come from America. I had another friend whose son had a bar mitzvah, his parents couldn't come from England. We can't even come in, non-citizens can't come into Israel at the moment. But, with each passing day, it seems like we're moving in the right direction. And so certainly, as I said, the company, Arza World, that I work with, are taking me to the United Arab Emirates in April, because there is a belief that many people are going to want to go there as well, or combine that with their trip, and to prepare us as guides to go there. So I think there will be trips from next year. Any other questions? So tomorrow we are going to Tel Aviv. We've spent the first 2 days out in the countryside. We've spent the first 2 days in open space. Tel Aviv is a very, very different kind of ambience. It's not dressier, but because Israel is a very casual place, but it's definitely urban. It's definitely city. So we'll have a different experience tomorrow. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mookie.
Thank you, Mookie. It was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you all.
Great.
March.
Everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
And my pleasure. I'll see you guys tomorrow, same time, same place. Good
Look
night.
forward to it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.